Agora foi.
Hi,
Hello, Peter.
how are you today?
I am good, and you?
Very well. This is fun.
Yeah, I love that we're going to be talking about technology through a rectangular screen. But I first would like to thank everyone who's watching us. Would like to thank Galeria Milan in São Paulo and Galeria Senda in Barcelona. Ilan Carpio for making this happen. Your amazing team, Peter, Steph, and
Thank
Scott,
you.
who helped me a
Thank
lot in the last few days. But especially thanks to you. You've agreed to speak to me today and yesterday, so I really appreciate your time.
It's been a pleasure. As you know, I like talking.
Which is a good start for a conversation, right?
Yes.
And then I will make a brief introduction, which probably isn't necessary because people who are here watching probably already know and love your work, but let's do it. So you were born in 1953 in New York. You then went ahead and got your degree in 1975 from Yale University in art history, where you then also recently worked as a director at the program, the painting program, the graduate program. And then you went to New Orleans to get your MFA in painting, where you
Yes.
graduated in 78.
Hmm.
Back to New York in the 80s, where you become part of the neo-conceptualist scene and you become known with your day glow, flat, abstract paintings that emphasize color and systems. More recently, in 2016, you had a solo show at the Schön Kunsthalle in Frankfurt. Sorry, my German. And you also had large-scale presentations of your installations at the Lever House in New York and at the Accademia di Belle Arti di Venezia. Sorry, my Italian. And
Very sounds good.
and you've been working with these big installations. I do want to talk about them later. And your paintings are very recognizable, and they tend to use these three geometric shapes of the square, the rectangle, and the connectors between them. And you refer to them as prisons, cells, and conduits. So maybe that's my first question to you. I wanted to hear you talk about this terminology and this vocabulary.
Sure. I mean, we're going back almost 40 years to 1980, 1981 when I first came to New York. And I'd always been inclined towards making geometric paintings. And, I was highly interested in minimalism and conceptual painting and uh, a lot of stuff that basically was geometric. And so arriving back in New York, for me, the question was, what was this geometry all about? And in a kind of typically postmodern argument, I said to myself, well, geometry, and in particular the square, isn't really ideal form divorced from everyday life and reality. Rather, geometry is the way space is organized in our society, especially in urban society, and subsequently a digitally based society. So,
Mm-hmm.
in a very sort of naive, humorous way, I said, I'm going to take the square and put bars on it and call it a prison,
Mm-hmm.
and point and uh, uh, sort of emphasize the idea of the square and geometry as confining, limiting, uh, 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 that the streets and highways and internet, these are all lines or conduits, as I call them, connecting things that are very limited.
Mm-hmm.
And then shortly thereafter, the prison became a cell. I took the bars off because I decided even having a window was too much freedom. So I took away the window, uh, and over the next couple of years, the vocabulary became prisons and cells connected by straight lines that I call conduits.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, in 1980, the model was the telephone. If you were sitting at home and your friend called you, you're not really alone. You're connected to another human being, but not physically and not spontaneously, but rather through this mechanism that this giant corporation provides for you. So
Yeah,
that's how
and
it started.
no, it makes sense. And it's interesting how there's also the repetition within the systems and then in your vocabulary. But you've spoken about how this repetition is also, so the small changes between one work and the next is also how we perceive change.
Yes, I very much believe in that. And that's sort of the wonderful lesson of minimalism and similar art movements. You can look at a painting by Agnes Martin or paintings by Agnes Martin or sculptures by Donald Judd. And of course, they are generally speaking in very similar configurations. But going from one to another as you perceive those differences uh, in a way that's sort of the at the heart of the experience of art for me.
Yeah, I love that in French, the word répétition also means rehearsal. So it is
Aha,
how we learn
exactly.
things. You've said something that I thought was very interesting about postmodernism being the shift from a utopian aspiration, and then in the 80s, it becomes this more dystopian spirit. And you say geometric abstraction is not describing an ideal world, but more this confined and isolated world. So I would love to hear you talk about that shift and maybe how that relates to technology.
Well, sure. And, I do think this is a interesting topic for Brazilian audiences because there was a lot of utopian geometric abstraction in Brazil through the 60s or 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And so that that kind of utopian abstraction was certainly a strong movement there. And going back to the Bauhaus and the suprematists and the neoplasticists, they all believed that somehow they were creating a new uh, socialistic technological world where everything would be revolutionized and transformed into a kind of utopian state. And of course, by the 80s, in architecture, art, music, there, or beginning in the 70s, there was certainly a response to that, and people saying, "Well, it didn't happen." And so, how do you? Some postmodernism is sort of about analyzing the utopian aspirations. Some is more parody. It takes a variety of forms. There was a wonderful show at the London V&A Victoria and Albert
Mm-hmm.
a few years ago on postmodernism, and it had examples from like pop music, like the Talking Heads, or architecture. Everybody from Michael Graves to Philippe Stark to Rem Koolhaas to fashion, et cetera, et cetera. And it made me really realize that this was really a pervasive way of thinking during the 80s and I guess the 90s.
Yeah, because you mentioned Talking Heads, I won't resist. And when you moved to New York in the 80s, you were a neighbor of David Byrne, from the lead man from the Talking Heads. I wanted to hear about that a little bit. Like, how is it to be moving back home and that being New York? And how was it for you in the 80s after kind of living abroad in a different, in different states, and then seeing New York with fresh eyes?
Well, as a young person, I stayed away from New York for a long time. And I went to boarding school and college and then outside of New York and then lived in New Orleans. And I was very ambivalent about New York, uh, partly because of the economics here during the 70s. It was a pretty dismal place, and also for family reasons. And I do have strong ties here. My dad was in politics in New York, He was he had the office of president of the city council, and he ran for mayor the year I was born. He lost. uh, and so I have family here going back, a while.
Hmm.
And so returning to New York it was, in a sense, accepting who I was, coming to terms with who I was from a certain family. And so it was a very charged psychological experience.
Hmm.
And my paintings in 8081 were, unlike the work I'm known for, rather dark and ominous. And certainly my initial feelings coming back to New York was a kind of traditional identification with existentialism
Hmm.
and the city as a lonely, um, dehumanizing place. And then all of a sudden, I made this connection with the telephone,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
or how people are connected, either in New York or anywhere else in the world.
Even the architecture, right? Like I've heard you speaking about how that kind of you look up and there's buildings, and you look across and there's buildings, and all the.
Yeah, I mean, for people who don't know New York, this won't make much sense, but I grew up at 48th Street and 3rd Avenue. And uh, during my childhood, after skyscraper office buildings sprung up all around the neighborhood. They had changed the zoning, in fact. And so I grew up in a hyper geometric atmosphere. So
Mhm.
sometimes I tell people that I'm actually a realist, not an
That
abstract
makes
artist.
sense, right?
Yeah.
In New York, it's very part of the landscape. Speaking of maybe the landscape, and you've said something that I really loved hearing, that Mark Rothko, who you admire, the light in his paintings refer to the light in nature, but that in your work, the light referred to technology.
I like to contradict myself, and uh, sitting here in New York on a cloudy day, talking about New York, he certainly had uh, Rothko paintings really do have a New York light.
Hmm.
Uh, Not New York in midsummer, but New York light filtered through tall buildings. By the time it reaches the street, there is no light and shadow. It's very uh, sort of even.
Hmm.
And but that is still a kind of nature, the light
Hmm.
of his environment.
Hmm.
Whereas, another shift during the 80s was from artists thinking of nature as the ultimate referent. In other
Hmm.
words, I'm going to paint a landscape or something like that. That's sort of falling apart, and artists of all kinds uh, questioning the idea of nature as the ultimate reality. To me, the key moment is when Richard Prince takes a photograph of a photograph,
Hmm.
so that as a photographer, he's no longer photographing the world, but he's photographing a cultural mass media artifact.
Hmm.
And all that's implied with that mass media has become our ultimate referent.
That is a great point. Like the advertisement is your landscape too, right?
Exactly.
Um,
Or
so
your
I'm gonna
iPhone.
I'm gonna move on to that
Or your
question.
iPhone.
Exactly. I also really enjoyed hearing you talk about how these artists influenced you in the 80s. So you've mentioned Barbara Kruger, Cindy Sherman, who's also acting from characters she sees in films and
Hmm.
creating this persona. You've mentioned Richard Prince, Donald Judd, and even Philip Guston. So I would love to hear a little bit about those influences and.
Well, Guston's his late work. Um, I mean, I've always loved cartoons and cartoon-like images, and the whole vocabulary that he developed late in his life, and which became such a sort of fluid vehicle for his subconscious, is fascinating. And, uh, it sort of reflects my own existential roots as being of a certain age. Growing up in the 60s, that was still very much present. The idea of our existence in a capitalist society is grim and alienated. Certainly, people don't think that way so much anymore, thanks
Mhm.
to maybe antidepressants. But for me, I connected with Guston very directly on that emotional level. But
Mhm.
also, he tends to present his space as a kind of proscenium, with
Yes.
everything very frontal, and there's often even a base or proscenium at the bottom. And he was a big deal in New York in the late 70s and early 80s
Hmm. Hmm.
for a lot of
Uh,
artists.
you've made me also think now about how you've said that your work is not the plane, but more a cross section.
Oh, right. When you see uh, geometric abstraction, you may, I think people kind of by nature might look at it as looking down like you're looking at a map.
Hmm.
But in my case, the way I visualize is everything is as a architectural elevation, or that you're viewing it from the side, not from above. And I think I never know whether people see the paintings that way. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. But clearly, they're intended to be ambiguous, even though I paint them from the point of view of as if I'm actually visualizing something from the side.
Um, I also, I don't know if people who follow you on Instagram know that you have two accounts. So one of
Yes.
them, Peter Hally Studio, has your work and, very colorful and maybe references what's going on in your career. And then you have Peter Hally, which is a more, I would say,
Ideological account.
ideological account where you don't share anything personal or about your career, but you share Google satellite images um, of, we can call it landscapes, I guess, or,
Earthscapes, yeah.
earthscapes. So I would love to hear you talk about that, especially because we are on Instagram and we're kind of sharing more than the Google
Yeah, I
satellite.
know. This goes back to the earlier days of Instagram. And I, I the impression I always had is that when you post something on Instagram, Instagram has the rights to it. Well, actually, they save it, so it becomes theirs to at least some extent. So I didn't want to give them anything of mine, and so I thought I'd give them something of Google's, and then if there was a problem, Google and Instagram could have it out. Uh, and what I this little conceptual project involved simply, uh, I happen to love Google Satellite. I've always been interested in technology and surveillance. And when I was a young person, one of the big things was there were all these military satellites that could take pictures like we see all the time of any place on Earth, with detail down to 1 meter. And but the public had absolutely no access to it.
Mhm.
So sometime in the early 80s, access to that satellite technology became uh, uh, available. And
Mhm.
this to me was like, you know, opening a treasure chest.
Mhm. Mhm.
And uh, I, I happen to enjoy um, sort of flipping around uh, Google's satellite, looking at different corners of the Earth. And that's how that came about.
I really enjoy it. I think it's
Thank you.
a great way to even think about your conduits, right? It's like connecting two squares to kind of spy on each other.
It's also a different way of making a painting in a sense, or an image, because I do pay a lot of attention to the composition.
And it is also about technology, right? And that space. So,
And yes, and sometimes all the crazy things going on Earth, like Chinese cities.
Hmm.
Happens to be a favorite of mine.
Yeah, no, it is a fascinating theme. And I know you've mentioned Rem Koolhaas before, and he talks a lot about these aspects too. And he mentions Le Corbusier's ideal architecture, or even the modular, the man that is kind of like this ideal shape. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Well, perhaps you can contribute on that because that actually is almost the prototypical example of postmodernism in architecture. As a young guy, Koolhaas becomes sort of obsessed with Le Corbusier,
Hmm.
and his book, Delirious New York, is sort of an attack on uh, Le Corbusier's utopian ideas about health and modern architecture. He said that uh, Le Corbusier wanted to create a modern architecture of health, whereas the New York architects creating these Art Deco skyscrapers wanted to create a modernism of pleasure.
Hmm.
And in a rather kind of Oedipal way, he just goes to town on Le Corbusier over and over again,
Hmm.
and well, sort of systematically deconstructs his aspirations without ever sort of losing his underlying filial love for Le Corbusier.
Yeah, that makes sense,
It's
right? Like
funny.
we're always responding to the generations that came before, and it's kind of a push and pull that feeds on itself again. But speaking of kind of the environment where we're in, wherever we are, but we are both in New York right now, connected through our phones. I wanted to talk a little bit about your last exhibition that I've seen here in New York, Heterotopia 2. Maybe you could
Hmm.
talk about the title of the show. I would love to hear about that. But I'll describe it and correct me if I make any mistakes. Just for people who haven't seen it, they can also Google it and see. But I will try and describe it, and you. Um,
Also, some of it is on my Instagram, Peter Hally Studio.
so yeah, check his Instagram to see what we're talking about in case you haven't seen it. But the gallery became this kind of maze-like installation.
Well, I sort of built a cube inside the gallery, and it was, I think, 8 rooms surrounding a central core,
Hmm.
almost like the composition of one of my paintings.
Hmm.
And there were staircases you could go up and down, and windows or openings in various places so you could see uh, from one room to another. And the entire interior was uh, painted in the kind of vocabulary that I use in the paintings. And the idea was to divide this uh, maze-like space, or it was a sequence of rooms. Each one contained one painting. So
Hmm.
each room was designed to frame a single painting. And it worked out really well. The up and down,
Oh
going
yeah, there were
upstairs,
stairs
downstairs,
connecting them.
the change of levels really helped. The gallery has really high ceilings. And the other thing that I was sort of fascinated by uh, uh, once we built this thing and I had a chance to experience it was you would look at the painting, and the painting almost seemed like the floor plan for the exhibition, and then the space of the exhibition almost seemed like it was represented in the paintings. So
Hmm.
there was this interesting crossover between the paintings, which were really done independently of the design of the installation, and how the three dimensions uh, uh, was reflected in the two-dimensional work, the pictures, and the two-dimensional pictures were represented in three dimensions. That wasn't the most articulate description, but it was kind of heady going back and forth between the two.
I think that's interesting that it's kind of hard to describe in a way. I tried, and I'm glad you did it for me. But as I told you, I visited the show multiple times,
Thank you.
and I call it maze-like because I do think there was a disorienting kind of moment where you were like, oh, where's the exit? Or are we supposed to go out through the same place where we got in? And there were kind of cutouts on the wall where you could spy on the other rooms, but not necessarily reach them. And it really made me think of, and I told you this yesterday, of like the rabbit hole you may get
Thank you.
into once you are on the internet, or specifically on social media. This idea that you can keep scrolling and then you start clicking on things and then you don't really know where you got there.
Thank you very much. Uh, yes, in fact, you're right. I was trying to make it as disorienting as possible without making it scary,
Mm-hmm,
with
mm-hmm.
still keeping it within the realm of being fascinating rather than how do I get out of here?
And then could you talk about the title of the show, Heterotopia, too?
Oh, sure. That's a term from Foucault that I was actually introduced uh, to by an artist named Tom McGuinn. And it's an essay he wrote in sometime in the 60s. And he he invented this term heterotopia as opposed to utopia. Hetero being apart from. Well, it
Mm-hmm,
doesn't really mean that, but that's how he uses it. A heterotopia is a space with specific boundaries used for specific purposes by a specific group of people.
mm-hmm,
For example, a university or a school is a heterotopia. Prison is a heterotopia. A ship is a heterotopia. Um, you can have good heterotopias and bad, like universities, or bad ones,
mm-hmm.
like prisons. And he was fascinated by how groups of people invent these spaces as a kind of alternative to the everyday world that everybody lives in.
Yeah. And one thing that just came to my mind is that I described, and your paintings are usually described as flat, but in case someone hasn't seen them in person, it is not true that they're totally flat. And the bands can be actually very thick in texture. So I would love for you to talk about your process, how you start your drawings in the computer, but then how the bands sometimes have 50 coats of paint, and how you need to take the tape to make
Thank you,
sure that
Gisela.
the edges are clean.
Well, to introduce that, let me just talk about why they're thick.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, in the last 20 years or so, both my experience teaching and how people talk about art, etc., more and more people talk about paintings as if they're just images
Mm-hmm.
or pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes a certain amount of sense because we live in a society of images, and what the image is in a painting has certainly become more central
Mm-hmm.
in the last 2 or 3 decades.
Mm-hmm.
But uh, to me, that's not what a great painting is. And in fact, if that's all a painting was, we probably wouldn't have paintings anymore. We just have digital prints.
Mm-hmm.
So, so my idea of what makes paintings is they're both an image and a tactile experience at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always use Vincent van Gogh. I don't know how you would pronounce that in Brazilian. It's hard to pronounce in any language.
In Portuguese, we say Van Gogh.
I should, yeah, in
Don't
Portuguese,
try it. It's all
Van
right.
Gogh. Yeah, and Dutch is hard too. Anyway, when you think of a Van Gogh, you think at least you think of the brushstrokes, the patterns of texture on the canvas, and so that to me is a uh, sort of epitomizes what we enjoy in paintings, both
Mm-hmm.
what the imagery is, or symbolism, or visual information, and this tactile information,
Mm-hmm.
which we can't touch, but we nevertheless perceive. And my own paintings contain several different textures. This fake stucco Rolodex
Mm-hmm.
covering the prisons and cells, and then the prison bars and the conduits connecting them,
Mm-hmm.
which stick out from the canvas, and they're painted with 50 coats of thick acrylic paint in order to build them up.
Mm-hmm.
And you just have to do 50 coats because if you did one thick coat, it would crack, sort of like
Mm-hmm.
plywood. So even though in many ways my work, I've uh, worked with the same absurdist vocabulary of prison, cell, and conduit for all these years, things do change. And in the
Mm-hmm.
early 90s, I began to compose on the computer
Mm-hmm.
using Illustrator. And all of a sudden, it wasn't a square anymore because I could stretch it in any direction. And using Illustrator uh, uh, created a much more plastic quality in the
Uh-huh.
paintings. I could stretch them every which way, and I could put something in and take something out very easily. Uh, and the computer also allows one to go from one drawing to another and turn it this way and that with like incredible ease. So that really had an effect on the way I make paintings.
Mm-hmm.
Then, so what I do is I draw on the computer,
Mm-hmm.
and then I print out one of the drawings I like, and I take the same paint that I use for the paintings, and I make the color studies,
Mm-hmm.
and I just keep at it till it comes out right.
I like the results. They look great. And you've also, I mean, I wonder if when you're doing one work, you do other works at the same time while these coats are drying.
Oh yes, there are two artists who worked for me building up the paint. Every five coats, you have to retape the painting. It really is laborious,
Mm-hmm.
and I used to do it all myself, but we probably wouldn't be here
If you were busy doing
talking
that.
if I had to do it all. If I had to do it all, and so it is kind of like a workshop, and
Mm-hmm.
the uh, the techniques are very methodical. They have to be because when you're building up paintings in this way, if somebody's measured something wrong, or if a line isn't perfectly horizontal or vertical, you have to start all over again. So we try not to do that.
Yes.
And so first the relief is built up, and the color is only applied at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of painted relief.
Interesting. So that's the roll of flax material. Is that
It's a brand name called Roll A Tex,
Rolletex? Sorry,
like roll a texture.
Okay.
And I started using that in 1981,
Mm-hmm.
partly as a result of this fascination I have for the texture of paintings, and more so in 1981 than today. As a young artist, my perception of all the wonderful painters in New York is everybody had a distinctive uh, texture or touch or physical quality to their paintings.
Mm-hmm.
You know, is it thick, like a de Kooning, or thin, like uh, Helen Frankenthaler, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to make fun of all that. And instead of using a brush and all kinds of fancy oil paint, I thought I could just roll on the texture. So
Uh-huh.
roll a text, and I just
I
roll
see.
it on.
Yeah, no, now I won't forget the right name.
It was really intended to be, in a sense, satire, parody, the idea of, the artist's unique touch being mechanized. And if I can throw this in, a lot of my creative ideas have their roots in parody or humor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there's definitely this, especially with painting, right? Like you associate the brush stroke with the presence of the body of the artist. And
Yeah, I mean, certainly that almost disappeared in the 1960s with minimalism and conceptualism. It's certainly come back. To my mind, there's a little too much emphasis on virtuosity
right.
rather than experimentation. Um, but in the 60s, with minimalism and Andy Warhol, there was also a new idea, a strong idea about removing the hand.
Mm-hmm.
removing the individual temporal human presence. And at least to some extent, my work is about that. Uh, there's a kind of I've never actually really thought about it in depth, but there's a lot of ambivalence about mind and body in my work. They are textural, they're physical experiences, and yet they're idealist insofar as I don't paint what I see, I only paint forms that are invented by the human mind.
Yeah, when I asked about your influences, I forgot to mention Andy Warhol, that you often, you know, mention when you talk about your um, influences. Specifically, you show a work that is the electric chair, and it's kind of yellow, and the images are very similar to each other. The photos are almost the same, and they form a grid. So and you talk about how that removal of the body, so he uses silk screen. But yeah, if
Well, actually, in Warhol's work of the 60s, you know, he was quote unquote a terrible silk screener. The ink is always running, and you actually see the trace of the body uh, in the way the silk screen squeegee
mm-hmm.
moves across the painting. So there too, there's a lot of uh, both the impersonal and the temporal, and the presence of a human body and the absence of a human body. It gets complicated.
Yeah, no. You refer to yourself as a multitasker, and you've published a very respected magazine from 1996 to 2005, Index magazine, where you would feature in-depth interviews with creatives from fashion world, the film industry, the music industry, literature, and you haven't written in a while. Before that, you also wrote a lot about art. But yesterday, when we spoke, you said you have two ideas for essays you won't write. But
Well, I'm so glad you asked me.
I would love to hear about that.
Well, I think I might write. Somebody actually invited me. My good friend Demetrio Paparoni in Italy invited me to write an article for an Italian newspaper. So I'm going to do one.
Hmm. At least one.
Yes, and that one is about um, thought experiments. And uh, growing up as an artist, and certainly this is something I chose to embrace, I really saw the most exciting contemporary art as being based on thought experiments. It's a term we associate with Einstein. He had a thought experiment. If I'm in a moving train and the speed of light is going this way or that way, what happens? I associated the exciting things going on in art with thought experiments. And the example I've been using lately is Dan Flavin,
Hmm.
who made work with fluorescent lights for
Hmm.
30 years or something. And so presumably one day, Dan Flavin made a sculpture using fluorescent light and said, wow, that's a good idea. What will happen if I do this for the next 30 years?
Hmm.
And I mean, that's a terrible idea or an absurdist idea. And yet it turned out to be pretty interesting.
Hmm.
And I think you can point to one example after another of artists in the recent past who whose work started as a thought experiment, and I hope including my own with the prisms, cells, and conduits
Hmm.
as a vocabulary. But you know, I get a little bit pessimistic about popular contemporary art today, and it's so much about narrative and storytelling and uh, or narrative figuration. And you know, to me, it's not as adventurous or as experimental. So I'm sort of arguing for to bring back the absurdist thought experiment in opposition to figurative narrative work, something like that.
if it gets published, I'll make sure to read.
Oh, thank you.
It's
I
a
think,
fascinating topic. I think that's very interesting. Yeah.
well, at least I always feel my job is to bring up stuff nobody else brings up. So I
Mhm.
don't think I've heard that argument. So I thought I would give it a try. And the other one is, I think, even is a little bit more provocative. Um, Michel Foucault is really interested in the relationship between plagues, pandemics,
Mhm.
and the development of modern cities and modern society.
Mhm.
And, how the European plague led to changes in plumbing, sanitation, zoning, what you could do, the uh, control of urban populations,
Mhm.
which in many ways was a good thing, but it
Mhm.
also represented a kind of centralized control.
Mhm.
So I was thinking to myself, what if the internet had been invented with a kind of social unconscious awareness that there would be a pandemic,
Mhm.
because it kind of is very helpful during a pandemic. And one can, I'm not saying this is true, but one can imagine
Mhm.
a kind of psychic desire to create this form of communication where we don't have to be in physical contact with each other.
Mhm.
What is it? Certainly, one purpose of that could be to prevent disease,
Mhm.
communicable disease. So again, please don't think I actually believe this, but it's again a thought experiment.
Mhm.
Can one imagine um, the rapid development and takeover of this kind of technology is somehow anticipating what has been actually an age-old human problem, that of periodic
Pandemics.
pandemics of disease.
Yeah, and it is interesting to think that we are now in a world that even before the pandemic, people in New York would walk on the sidewalks looking at their phones. Like, so we're already kind of um, not looking at each other even when we are, out there in the world. So maybe the pandemic is just intensifying that.
Well, the common interpretation of iPhones and being online is simply social control. That we don't go out and cause trouble in the streets and mingle indiscriminately, but everything has to go through the control mechanisms of the corporations and the and digital logic.
And one interesting thing I've heard you mentioned is that your paintings became more popular after the iPhone was invented. In
Yeah, I'm sure I'm not the only artist, but I've always had a big problem because my work doesn't look very good in printed.
Mhm.
It's fluorescent color, which can't be reproduced by traditional printing inks. And then if you use fluorescent color, they look more like posters than like paintings. So it's always been, I've always worked hard to get good reproductions in books, but it's always an uphill struggle.
Mhm.
Whereas on a LED screen, they just look great,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
and I think evoke what they actually look like.
Yeah, that's interesting. I also, since we're still talking a little bit about your multitasking as, a writer, I would love to talk about your years at Yale, where you had this, the title that is similar enough to Joseph Albers when he was there. And I wanted to know, it's a very competitive program. I think of 600 people who apply, only 20 get in. And some of your former students were recently awarded the MacArthur Grant, which is a
Three.
three. What did I say?
No, I just pointed out three of them
Three.
because
Yeah, yeah. So three of your
I
former
like to show
students.
off, even though I had
Yeah, no,
nothing to
you
do with
have to show
it.
off. It's for Brazilians who may not know, the MacArthur Grant is nicknamed the Genius Grant, so it's pretty special. And I would love to hear how what did you make to try and keep the program, interesting, or like make it a good environment, and also maybe the experience of being in touch firsthand with now three geniuses?
Well, they're more geniuses. The only three got the award. I was an undergraduate at Yale, and I went there because of their art program. Uh, but at the time, it was very conservative, and they wouldn't let me in American universities. You major in art. They wouldn't let me
Mm-hmm.
because I wouldn't draw still lives. To make a long story short, and I was interested in contemporary art. So that's why I studied art history. So it was a very unhappy experience for me. And, as I was 18 or 19 and, really felt that this was a major blow for me in becoming an artist. Of course, I did keep going. And so I had been a visitor there, and years later they were hiring uh, they were looking for a professor to also be director of the painting program, and they hired me. And I remember thinking, if only there had been a little bird on my shoulder when I was 19 saying, Peter, don't worry, you're going to come back and run this place.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Would have been stuff like that happens in life. Uh, and, my um, philosophy for running the program was really, really simple. It was to democratize choices as much as possible. We would invite visitors and to give as many people as possible equal opportunity to have input in that, and uh, to increase the diversity of the student body, and uh, uh, and to make it a supportive community.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, when I was at Yale, the art school was brutal. Students would cry during critiques. Everybody was depressed. Everybody talked, well, I'll start making great work when I get out of here. Because of my personal experience, I didn't think that was any way
Mm-hmm.
to let's say, nurture young artists. And so it was really important to me to create an atmosphere where everybody felt accepted and not attacked for these sort of very vulnerable small plants that they were growing out of the ground to get their vision,
Yeah, no,
start their
I
vision.
think you made a good job, right? Because they're out in the world, your former students doing well.
Yeah, I'm so proud of many of them, and uh, both as artists in New York and as teachers. Uh, they're really. I mean, I feel privileged because many of the best young artists went to Yale, and so it was a privilege to teach them. But it's also uh, really great to see how they're proceeding through life.
Where
Sometimes I say I had 200 children.
Yeah, I mean, there is something about it, right? You're seeing
Yeah,
them grow, and you're kind of
yeah, I get really
making sure
excited.
that you let them be who they have to be.
Right.
My last question, because I don't want to take too much of your time, we're almost done. But since you occupied the space of Joseph Albers,
Oh, yes, Alvarez, right. Go ahead.
and he also had part of his career dedicated to the homage to the square. I would love to hear. You were not there at the same time that he was there. He had left already, right? But I would love to hear about um, even the indirect influences of him on you, or the differences between your work and his. And I'd just love to hear you talk about him.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I wasn't there when he was there, but I went to boarding school at Phillips Academy Andover in Massachusetts that had a terrific art program, and several of the teachers there had been at Yale when Albers was there.
Hmm.
So the program was very Bauhaus oriented,
Hmm.
and it was a terrific stimulus for me in terms of becoming an artist. So I was sort of taught by the Albers students. And my great uncle was an amateur painter who had a copy of The Interaction of Color around.
Mhm.
And I encountered it very early on. And uh, color theory, or Albers' color theory, has always been in the background of my work. How the marvelous title of his book, The Interaction of Colors, how colors affect each other, as you can see from that example. And then Homage to the Square was this like wonderful formalist project where he takes what he says is a neutral form, the square. He puts three or four squares in a concentric configuration and uses that to study color and study light. So in to some extent, I'm kind of doing that, except Albers was very much in love with the natural world.
Mhm.
He talked about the color of fall leaves in the northeastern United States and things like that. So if you get rid of the nature and if you get rid of the idea of the square as this kind of neutral formal device, uh, well, not get rid of them, but I think my work transforms those two ideas, but it's related to it for sure.
Yes, it's still reverberating. I feel like the interaction of color is still unfolding. It still makes sense in a
Well,
way.
it's such a beautiful book, and he wrote it in his 60s. I mentioned to you yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, he didn't really start painting till he was 50. You know, he did all kinds of prints and glass and non-traditional media. So the whole story of Albers at Black Mountain College, at Yale, the paintings and book he wrote in his later life, it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and in the sense of repetition that you talk about, he has this amazing quote where he says that he if he were a fisherman, he would need millions of centuries to use all the colors in his square to use them all the infinite possibilities.
Exactly.
So Peter, this was a
Well,
delight.
I
I
can't
thank you
thank you enough.
again.
It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to maybe one day seeing you in person. And thanks again to everybody who watched and all the galleries that supported this and to your team that helped me so much in the last few weeks.
Thank you so much. It was really fun to do. Bye bye
Bye.
now.
Thank you.
Bye.